Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. Mark Davis was at a crossroads. At 23, he was in his final year of law school, juggling the pressures of his studies and a part-time job. But no matter how hard he worked, his debts continued to pile up. The weight of his late father's financial mistakes hung heavy over him, and despite all his efforts, the future felt bleak. He walked the rainy streets of a small college town in Texas, his thoughts clouded by the uncertainty of his next move. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call he wasn't expecting. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks," came the voice on the other end. "I'd like to meet with you. It's about your financial situation." Mark frowned, unsure of how to respond. He didn't recognize the name. How did she know about his debts? "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important," the voice continued, before the line went dead. Confused and curious, Mark glanced up at the gloomy sky and made his way to the bistro. It wasn't much, just a small cafe with warm lighting, but he had a feeling this meeting would be anything but ordinary. Inside the bistro, Mark spotted a striking woman sitting at a corner table. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair styled perfectly. She looked out of place in such a casual setting, but then again, Mark didn't know what to expect. "Mr. Davis," she said when he walked in, her voice calm and composed. Mark nodded and took a seat. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but he couldn't deny the mystery of it all. "I know about your debts," Eleanor said, cutting to the chase. "And I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark stared at her, confused. What could this woman possibly want from him? "I will pay off all your debts. I will ensure your financial security, but in return, you will marry me." The words hung in the air like an impossible proposition, something out of a movie. Mark blinked, unable to process what she was saying. Marry her? He couldn't believe it. "I'm serious," she said, her tone unwavering. "This isn't about love, it's a business arrangement. You will be my husband, and in return, you will get everything you've been struggling for." Mark's mind raced. Why would this woman, this powerful, wealthy woman, offer such a thing to him? It didn't make sense. But the offer was there, hanging in the air, and Mark found himself unable to turn it down. He sat back in his chair, still trying to wrap his head around what had just been proposed. "Why me?" he asked, his voice thick with skepticism. "You don't know me. You don't even know what I'm going through." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "You're young. You have nothing left to lose. You're desperate enough to consider it." Mark didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. On one hand, he had his pride. On the other, he had his debts and his future. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his younger sister's tuition was due soon. He was running out of time, and his options were growing slimmer by the day. As the evening wore on, Eleanor continued to explain the terms of their arrangement. No love, no interference with each other's lives, and no strings attached beyond the contract they would sign. It sounded cold, mechanical, and yet, the offer was tempting. "I will ensure that your life changes. You will have the financial freedom you've been desperate for," Eleanor said, her gaze unwavering. Mark sat there, the silence between them thick with tension. His mother's words echoed in his mind, "You have to save us. You have to do whatever it takes." Mark took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I'll do it." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. The decision was made. Mark had agreed to marry Eleanor, not out of love, but out of necessity. As he walked home that night, soaked by the rain, his thoughts were filled with doubt and uncertainty. Was he making a mistake? He had just signed away his freedom for a chance at a better life. But deep down, he knew he had no other choice. Tomorrow, everything would change. The following evening, Mark found himself standing at the entrance of Brooks Estates. The mansion loomed in front of him, its grand columns and pristine stone facade almost intimidating. This was no longer the small college town he had known all his life. This was another world, a world where he was now supposed to belong. He stood there for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. The rain had stopped, but the chill of the night air still lingered. He adjusted the collar of his jacket before walking up the long driveway, his steps slow but steady. As he approached the front door, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway. The door swung open before he could even ring the bell, and there stood Eleanor, looking as composed as ever, her silver hair perfectly styled and her sharp suit reflecting her no-nonsense demeanor. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice steady as always. "Come in. Let's get you settled." Mark nodded silently and stepped inside. The hallway was grand, with high ceilings and ornate chandeliers. Everything about the house screamed luxury, and yet, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Eleanor led him down a long corridor to a room at the end of the hall. "This will be your room," she said, opening the door to a space that could have been a suite at a five-star hotel. The bed was large, with soft, white linens, and the view from the window looked out onto manicured gardens. It was beautiful, in a way that felt almost unreal. Mark couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. Was he really going to live here? Was this really his life now? He turned to Eleanor, who was watching him carefully. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said. "But I want you to feel comfortable here. This is your home now, too." Mark forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Eleanor gave him a small nod before stepping out of the room. "I'll leave you to unpack. Dinner will be at 7. Don't be late." As she closed the door behind her, Mark was left alone with his thoughts. He sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the plush surroundings. Was this really what he had agreed to? The thought felt heavy on his chest. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn, but here he was. This was his reality now, whether he was ready for it or not. As the minutes passed, Mark unpacked his things, though it felt more like a mechanical task than anything else. He hung his clothes in the spacious closet and placed his bag on the desk, the weight of his decision still settling in. He kept thinking back to that moment when he had agreed to marry Eleanor. Was he doing the right thing? The thought of his mother's mounting medical bills, his sister's tuition, all the financial burdens that had driven him to this point, made him question if he had any other choice. He had hoped for more, maybe a different path, maybe a way to make it on his own. But he had taken the deal, and now there was no going back. At 7 p.m., Mark made his way downstairs. The house was quiet, but there was a buzz in the air, like something was about to happen. Eleanor was already seated at the dinner table, her posture perfect as she glanced up at him. "You're right on time," she said with a small, approving smile. "Please, sit." The meal was served elegantly, though Mark could hardly concentrate on the food. He felt like he was on display, unsure of how to act in a world that felt so foreign to him. They ate in silence for a while, the clinking of cutlery the only sound. Then, Eleanor spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Mark, I want you to understand that this arrangement is strictly professional. There is no room for emotion or personal attachment. You and I are not friends. We are partners in this contract, nothing more. Is that clear?" Mark looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze. There was no warmth in her eyes, only business. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, I understand," he replied. "Good," she said. "We'll keep it that way. I expect you to honor the terms of our agreement without question." As they finished dinner, Mark found himself wondering how much longer he could keep up this facade. How long could he pretend that this was just a business arrangement, when his heart was already starting to feel something more for her? He couldn't deny that there was something about Eleanor, the way she carried herself, her calm demeanor, the way she took control of every situation. It was hard not to be impressed. But he had to remind himself that this was not a romance. This was business, and nothing more. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark settled into his new routine at Brooks Estates, still feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't his own. Each morning, he woke up in the grand bedroom, its opulence a constant reminder of the deal he had made. As he wandered the massive hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Eleanor remained as distant as ever, sticking to the terms of their arrangement. They rarely spoke outside of what was necessary. She was business, through and through, and Mark was beginning to realize just how calculated everything in her life was. Their conversations were brief and always centered around their contract. Mark had begun to accept the reality of his situation, though part of him still struggled to fully let go of his pride. The more he lived in this luxurious world, the more he questioned what he had done. Was it worth it? The lavish dinners, the designer clothes, the quiet, polished life, was any of it enough to make up for the fact that he was living a lie? One evening, as Mark sat alone in the living room, he heard the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor. Eleanor appeared at the doorway, looking as composed as always. She was dressed in a tailored black dress, her hair pulled back into an elegant knot. "Mark, I need you to accompany me to a charity event tonight," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "It's important for our image." Mark nodded, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Another public event, another chance to play his part in their charade. He was used to the routine by now, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way Eleanor looked at him, or maybe it was the strange mix of curiosity and uncertainty that had begun to grow between them. He followed her upstairs, where a stylist awaited him to prepare for the event. Eleanor had already been groomed and was waiting for him downstairs when he finished changing into a sharp tuxedo. He looked at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone was the college student struggling to pay off his father's debts. Now he was a man playing a role, one that he hadn't quite figured out yet. As he walked downstairs, Eleanor was standing by the door, her expression unreadable as she looked him up and down. "You clean up well," she said, her voice void of emotion. "Let's go." The drive to the event was silent, both of them lost in their thoughts. Mark couldn't help but notice the way people seemed to part when Eleanor walked into the room. She was a force, commanding attention with every step she took. Mark felt like he was just a shadow beside her, a man who didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. The event was held in a grand ballroom, and as they entered, the flash of cameras and the hum of conversation filled the air. Eleanor moved through the crowd with ease, greeting important guests, and exchanging pleasantries. Mark followed her, trying to stay in character, but it was hard to ignore the way he felt out of place. He didn't belong here, not like this. As the night wore on, Eleanor introduced Mark to several key figures in her social circle. They spoke about business, about charity work, and about all the things that seemed so distant from Mark's reality. At one point, as they stood by the bar, a well-dressed woman approached Eleanor, her eyes narrowing as she took in Mark's presence. "Eleanor," the woman said with a polite smile, "who is this?" Eleanor turned to Mark, her face giving nothing away. "This is Mark, my husband," she said flatly. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but didn't press the issue. "It's a pleasure," she said before walking away. Mark could feel the weight of the woman's gaze on him as she left, as though she were silently judging him, trying to understand what he was doing in Eleanor's world. He tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, was he starting to care about Eleanor, or was he just getting lost in the fantasy of this life? As the night drew to a close, Eleanor and Mark stood by the exit, ready to leave. Eleanor turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "Remember, this is for appearances. Don't forget why you're here," she said, her eyes locking onto his. Mark nodded, but deep down, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Was this really just about appearances? Or had something more started to form between them? The following week, Mark continued to adjust to his new life with Eleanor. The routine had become familiar, days filled with meetings, charity events, and the quiet luxury of Brooks Estates. But no matter how much he tried to immerse himself in the world Eleanor had created, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He had agreed to this arrangement for financial security, to save his family, but now he found himself questioning what it all meant. Eleanor remained as distant as ever, focused on the terms of their contract, and Mark could feel the emotional wall between them growing taller by the day. Yet, something had shifted within him. The more he spent time with her, the more he found himself drawn to her. There was an intensity about her, a calm and composed demeanor that marked her as someone who had everything under control. But underneath that exterior, Mark couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. Was she ever truly happy? Or was this all just a game for her, a business transaction disguised as marriage? One evening, Mark was in his study, looking over some papers when Eleanor walked in. She was dressed casually in a simple blouse and jeans, her usual polished appearance replaced by something softer. Mark looked up, surprised by the change. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice quieter than usual. He gestured for her to sit, closing the papers in front of him. "What's going on?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "I know this isn't easy for you. For either of us," she began, looking down at her hands. "But I want you to understand something. This marriage, this arrangement, it's not just about business. It's about trust." Mark raised an eyebrow. Trust? In what way? He hadn't thought about it that way before. It was all business, a transaction. But her words lingered in his mind. She continued, "I've spent most of my life building everything I have, and I've done it alone. I know what it's like to be trapped in a world where everyone is trying to use you for something. I thought I could handle it alone, but now I'm not so sure." The vulnerability in her voice caught Mark off guard. For the first time, he saw something more than the cold businesswoman he had come to know. He leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice gentle. "We're in this together, remember?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes softening for a moment. "I know," she replied. "But it's hard to let anyone in. Especially someone like you. I never imagined I would be in a position like this, with someone who isn't like the others." Mark wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he couldn't deny that her words stirred something within him. He had never seen this side of her before, the side that wasn't just the businesswoman who ran the show. There was a human side to her, one that was struggling with her own fears and insecurities. For a brief moment, their worlds collided in a way neither of them had expected. The conversation was brief, but it left Mark thinking long after Eleanor had left the room. The idea of trust, of real connection, had never felt so complicated. He had thought that their arrangement was simple, two people with different goals, using each other to get what they wanted. But now, as he sat alone in his study, he realized that things were starting to change. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was starting to feel things, and that scared him. Was it possible that he was falling for Eleanor? He quickly pushed the thought aside. No. This was a business arrangement. Nothing more. But as the days passed, those feelings grew harder to ignore. Mark found himself thinking about her more and more. Every time they interacted, he felt a pull, something he couldn't explain. He was starting to see her differently, not just as the woman who had saved him from his debts, but as someone who was real, with her own struggles, her own dreams. It was easy to forget that behind the walls of Brooks Estates, behind the luxury and the status, there was a person who had built her life from nothing, who had learned the hard way that trust was a rare commodity. And now, in a world where nothing seemed real, Eleanor was asking for it from him. He didn't know if he could give it to her, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this marriage wasn't as fake as he had thought. Days passed, and the distance between Mark and Eleanor seemed to grow smaller, but neither of them knew how to bridge the gap. They continued their lives, side by side, in a partnership that felt more real than either had expected. Mark's feelings toward Eleanor were no longer just about the arrangement. He had begun to see her in a new light, no longer just the calculating businesswoman, but a woman with her own vulnerabilities. The more time they spent together, the more he found himself drawn to her strength, her resilience, and, surprisingly, her kindness. Eleanor, on the other hand, remained as composed as ever, but there were moments when Mark could see something shift in her eyes, a brief flicker of something deeper. It was as if she, too, was beginning to question the nature of their relationship. But neither of them spoke about it. They didn't have to. The silence between them said enough. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with meetings and social obligations, Eleanor asked Mark to join her for dinner in the small dining room they used for private meals. She had been unusually quiet throughout the day, and Mark couldn't help but notice the tension in her posture. As they sat down, Eleanor finally broke the silence. "Mark," she began, her voice slow and serious. "I need to talk to you about something important." Mark looked at her, his curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" he asked, setting his fork down. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said. "About this arrangement. And about where we're going from here." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had known that things couldn't stay as they were forever, but hearing her say it out loud made everything feel more real. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor sighed, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her glass. "I never wanted a real marriage," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I thought I could keep my emotions separate, but now I'm not so sure. This," she gestured between them, "isn't just a business deal anymore, is it?" Mark didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of her words, but he didn't know how to respond. Was he supposed to confess how he felt? Or was it better to keep things professional, as they had always been? The silence between them grew thicker, more charged. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Mark, I'm not asking for anything more from you," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I need to know that we're on the same page. I need to know that this, whatever this is, it's not just about the contract anymore." Mark swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He knew that what Eleanor was asking was a question he couldn't avoid any longer. They had both been playing a role for so long, pretending that this marriage didn't mean more than it did. But the truth was, they had both begun to feel something real. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, and it had been growing for weeks. "I never thought it would be like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was just business. But now I'm not so sure either." Eleanor didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, as if waiting for him to say more. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. Was this really happening? Were they finally going to admit what they had been avoiding for so long? He took a deep breath and looked at her, his mind made up. "I think we both know this isn't just a contract anymore," he said. "We've both been pretending, but it's real. I don't know what that means yet, but I can't pretend it doesn't matter." Eleanor's gaze softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that wasn't just guarded, but genuine. She reached across the table and took his hand, her touch surprisingly warm. "I'm glad to hear you say that," she said quietly. "I've been afraid to admit it, too. But I don't want to lose whatever this is, whatever we're starting to build together." Mark squeezed her hand gently, his mind finally clearing. He didn't know where this would go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was making the right decision. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The days following their conversation felt different. It was as if a new understanding had settled between Mark and Eleanor, though neither of them knew exactly what it meant. They continued with their routine, but now there was an unspoken connection, a shift in the air whenever they were in the same room. Mark had always admired Eleanor from a distance, but now, after their heart-to-heart, he found himself seeing her in a different light. She wasn't just the powerful, untouchable woman who had saved him from his financial ruin. She was someone who had been through her own struggles, someone who had built everything on her own, and maybe just maybe someone who was starting to open up to him. But even as they grew closer, a part of Mark couldn't forget why they were in this situation to begin with. They had entered into this marriage as strangers, bound by a contract, and that reality was hard to ignore. He didn't want to get hurt. He didn't want to risk falling deeper into something that wasn't real, but every time he looked at Eleanor, every time their hands brushed in passing, the wall he had so carefully built around his heart began to crumble. Eleanor, too, seemed different. The guardedness that had once defined her interactions with him had faded, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. She still maintained control of everything, but now there were moments when she let her guard down, when she smiled at him without that practiced politeness, when she laughed at his jokes, or when she asked how his day had gone in a way that felt genuine. It was a change, small but undeniable. And it left Mark questioning everything he thought he knew about their arrangement. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the estate, the conversation took another unexpected turn. Eleanor had been unusually quiet, gazing out at the sprawling gardens beneath the moonlight. Mark could sense she was deep in thought, so he didn't press her, but he couldn't help the curiosity that tugged at him. After a while, he broke the silence. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes distant for a moment, before focusing on him. "I've been thinking about the future," she said quietly. "About what happens after all of this." Mark raised an eyebrow, unsure if she meant their arrangement or something deeper. "What do you mean?" he asked. She sighed, leaning back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I've always kept my personal life separate from everything else," she continued. "I've always believed that emotions were a weakness, that they would only get in the way of what I needed to accomplish. But now, I'm starting to wonder if I've been wrong all along." Mark listened intently, sensing the vulnerability in her voice. It was a side of Eleanor he had never seen before, the woman who had always been so controlled, now questioning the very principles that had defined her life. "Maybe it's time to let go of some of that control," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe it's time to take a chance on something real. Something beyond this contract." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. The thought of Eleanor wanting something real, something that went beyond their agreement, stirred something deep within him. He had spent so much time trying to keep his feelings in check, trying to stay detached, but now, as he looked at her, he realized that he was no longer sure what was real anymore. He had fallen for her, and he couldn't deny it. He had tried to protect himself, to stay focused on the practical reasons for this marriage, but the emotions he had kept buried were starting to surface. He had never expected to feel this way. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "I think I'm starting to understand what you mean. I think I've been holding back, too." She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but also something else, something that felt like hope. "Mark, are you saying?" She didn't finish the sentence, but he knew what she was asking. He nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I think I've been pretending, too," he said. "But now, I'm not sure I can anymore. What we have, it's more than just a contract, isn't it?" Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time, Mark saw something truly vulnerable in her eyes. She reached across the table and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Maybe it is," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's something more than I ever expected." In that moment, everything changed. The walls that had kept them apart for so long began to crumble, and for the first time since their marriage had begun, Mark felt like he was truly seeing Eleanor for the woman she was, not just the businesswoman or the woman he had once seen as untouchable. And maybe, just maybe, they were both ready to let go of the contract and start building something real. The days that followed felt different, as if the ground beneath Mark and Eleanor had shifted. The walls they had carefully built between them started to crumble, piece by piece. What had once been a cold, calculated partnership had begun to feel like something more. But even with the newfound connection between them, neither of them could ignore the lingering doubt that hung in the air. It wasn't that they didn't trust each other, it was just that their history, the foundation of their marriage, was built on a contract, not love. Eleanor, always the stoic one, seemed to struggle with her own emotion. Mark had noticed the subtle changes in her behavior, the way she now looked at him when they spoke, the small touches that once would have been unnoticed. She was letting him in, but it was clear that the fear of vulnerability still haunted her. And for Mark, the deeper they grew, the more he questioned his own feelings. Was he falling for Eleanor because of their connection, or was it because he had spent so long pretending it was something it wasn't? One evening, after a particularly long day of business meetings and social obligations, Mark found himself sitting alone in the study. His thoughts were scattered, the weight of his emotions pressing heavily on him. He had thought that he could handle the fake marriage, the feelings, the confusion. But now, sitting in the quiet of the room, he realized how much he had truly changed. He had never intended for any of this to happen. He had agreed to a business arrangement, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, everything had shifted. Eleanor had become more than just a business partner. She had become someone he cared about. And that terrified him. What if he was getting in too deep? What if he was setting himself up for heartbreak? He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, but could he trust those feelings? Or were they just a product of the life he was now living? Just as he was lost in his thoughts, Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in a simple silk robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. There was a softness to her expression that Mark hadn't seen in a long time. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, her footsteps quiet against the polished hardwood floor. "Mark," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "We need to talk." Mark looked up, meeting her gaze. There was something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. Vulnerability. She had always been so guarded, but tonight, she seemed different. More real. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, taking a seat beside him on the couch. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot about what we've been building, what we've been doing." She paused, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her robe. "And I don't want to pretend anymore, not with you, Mark." Her words hit him like a wave, sweeping away any remnants of doubt. She was afraid too. She didn't want to keep up the facade. She didn't want to be alone in this anymore. And neither did he. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them. He reached out and took her hand in his, the gesture gentle but firm. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him, "I don't want to pretend either. I know we started this as a contract, but it's become so much more. I care about you. I care about us." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of hope in her gaze. She squeezed his hand, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know where this will go, but I don't want to hide from it anymore." The honesty in her words, the way she looked at him, made something shift inside Mark. The fear that had held him back seemed to fade, replaced by something stronger: trust. They had both been afraid to admit it, but the truth was undeniable now. What they had wasn't just a contract. It was real. And for the first time, neither of them was afraid to face that truth. Mark leaned in, his heart racing as he kissed her gently, slowly. It wasn't just a kiss out of obligation or routine, it was a kiss that spoke of something deeper, something unspoken. The connection between them had always been there, but now it was more than just an arrangement. It was love, growing slowly but surely, despite all the obstacles that had once stood in their way. As they pulled away, Eleanor looked at him, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Maybe this was the plan all along," she said, her voice light, but the warmth in her eyes told a different story. Mark smiled back, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. "Maybe it was," he said, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate the complexities of their relationship. What had once been a marriage of convenience was slowly, almost imperceptibly, transforming into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. Their connection had grown stronger, but so had the pressure of their pasts. The deal they had made, the reasons they had entered this arrangement, were always there, lingering between them. The thought of the contract still weighed heavily on Mark. He knew Eleanor had always been driven by logic, by the need for control, but he wasn't sure if she truly understood the depth of what was happening between them. He wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of the walls she had built around her heart. He had opened up, but he still couldn't fully understand her. She had been through so much, built her empire from the ground up, but he wondered, was she willing to share that burden with him? Was she ready to give herself fully to this relationship? One evening, after a charity event where they had both been playing the perfect couple in front of the cameras, they returned home to the quiet of Brooks Estates. The house, though beautiful, felt emptier than ever. Mark and Eleanor sat in silence in the living room, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mark glanced at her, his thoughts racing. He could tell something was on her mind. Eleanor wasn't the type to speak unless it was necessary, but tonight, she seemed lost in thought. "Eleanor," he said softly, breaking the silence. "What's really going on? You're quiet tonight." She didn't immediately answer, but after a moment, she met his gaze. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, something Mark had rarely seen in her. "I'm just thinking about everything," she said, her voice low. "About this, about us." Mark's heart beat faster, sensing that this conversation was different from the others. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a deep breath, looking away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I never wanted this to happen," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "I never wanted to let anyone in. I thought I could keep it all separate, me work, my life, my emotions. But now, I'm not sure I know where I end and this thing between us begins." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had known that Eleanor was afraid, but hearing her admit it so openly took him by surprise. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Eleanor," he said gently, "we've both been pretending, haven't we? We've been hiding behind this contract, thinking that's all this is. But it's not. It's real. It's more than just a business arrangement." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read his intentions. "You really think so?" she asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice. Mark nodded, squeezing her hand. "I do. I know we started this as a deal, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being just about the contract. I care about you, Eleanor. I want more than just a marriage of convenience." Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, her eyes softening, as though she were allowing herself to believe the words he was saying. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," she said, her voice a mixture of uncertainty and fear. "I've built my life on my own, Mark. I don't know how to let someone else in. But, maybe, for the first time, I'm willing to try." Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He could see a change in her, the shift from guarded to open. He had never imagined that this cold, controlled woman would let herself be vulnerable with him. And in that moment, he realized just how much he had come to care for her. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have to rush anything. But I want to build something with you, Eleanor. Something real." She smiled then, a small but genuine smile that made Mark's chest tighten with affection. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "But I'm willing to take that chance with you." And in that moment, everything felt possible. They were no longer bound by a contract. They were no longer playing a part. What had started as a fake marriage had now become something more, something that neither of them had expected, but something that was real. Together, they would face whatever came next, but for the first time, they were doing it as partners, with trust and love guiding them forward. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What started as a business arrangement had blossomed into something deeper, something genuine. The walls between them that once seemed so insurmountable had crumbled, and they found themselves building a life together, not based on obligation, but on shared trust, understanding, and a growing love that neither could deny. They had become partners in every sense of the word, not just in marriage, but in life. The once sterile, contract-driven connection was now filled with warmth, laughter, and mutual respect. Eleanor, who had once been so determined to keep her emotions in check, now found herself leaning on Mark, allowing herself to be vulnerable with him in ways she never thought possible. And Mark, who had entered the arrangement with doubts and fears, had come to realize that what they had was worth more than any deal he could have made. They had truly become a family, forged not by a piece of paper, but by the bond they shared. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of Brooks Estates, looking out at the horizon, Mark turned to Eleanor, his heart full. "I never imagined it would be like this," he said, his voice filled with awe. Eleanor smiled, her eyes reflecting the same realization. "Me neither," she replied softly. "But I'm glad it is. I think we both needed this, more than we ever knew." There was a quiet moment between them as they took in the view, each reflecting on how far they had come. What had started as a desperate solution to their individual problems had become something they both cherished. It was more than just a marriage, it was a partnership, a true bond between two people who had opened their hearts to each other, despite the fears that once held them back. The next day, as they prepared for another public event, this time a charity gala they were both deeply involved in, Mark looked at Eleanor with a sense of pride. She had come so far from the woman he first met, so guarded, so focused on business. Now, she had let him in, and in doing so, had allowed herself to experience the richness of life she had kept hidden for so long. He could see it in the way she smiled, the way she held herself. She was no longer just the CEO, the woman in control. She was also the woman who had learned to trust, to love, and to allow someone else to be her equal partner. As they stood together at the event, hand in hand, they were no longer just playing a role. They were genuinely connected. They were a family, and they were proud of the journey they had taken to get there. As the evening drew to a close, Mark turned to Eleanor, his eyes full of affection. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want to face it with you," he said. Eleanor looked up at him, her heart swelling with love. "I feel the same way," she replied softly, her fingers brushing against his. "We've come a long way, Mark, and whatever happens next, I know we'll face it together." In that moment, the future seemed bright, full of possibilities. They had built something real, something that neither of them had expected when they first entered into their arrangement. But what they had now was stronger than any contract or deal. They had love, trust, and a commitment to one another. As they walked hand in hand into the future, they knew that together, they could face anything.